Ethan Caldwell drove the last nail into the bedroom wall and stood back, hands trembling, chest heaving, staring at a room he had built for a woman he had never once touched, never heard laugh out loud, never seen cry. A woman who existed only in letters. His neighbor Roy stood in the doorway, jaw tight, voice low. "Ethan, she's not coming. You know that, right?" Ethan didn't answer. He just picked up the wooden chair he had carved by hand, set it beside the window, and whispered to no one at all, "She'll need somewhere to sit when she writes." If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning and find out how a man builds a home for a woman he's never met, and what happens the moment she finally arrives. The first time Roy Baxter saw what Ethan was doing, he laughed so hard he had to lean against his truck to keep from falling over. It was a Tuesday morning in early October, the kind of morning in Montana where the cold comes in quiet and mean, where your breath turns white the second you step outside, and every sensible man in the county was either inside drinking coffee or out checking on his cattle before the first frost settled in deep. Roy had driven the old gravel road past Ethan's property on his way to pick up feed from the co-op in Milford, and he almost didn't stop. But something made him slow down, something that didn't look right. Because Ethan Caldwell, a man who had lived alone on that hillside for 11 years, a man who kept to himself so completely that some of the newer folks in town genuinely believed the property was abandoned, was framing a second structure behind his workshop. Not repairing something old, building something new. Roy pulled off the road and rolled down his window. "Ethan," he called out, "what in the world are you putting up?" Ethan didn't look up from the wood he was measuring. His voice came back flat and even the way it always did, like the question didn't particularly surprise him. "A house." Roy stared for a long moment. "A house?" "That's what I said." "For who?" And that was when Ethan finally looked up. He set down his pencil, straightened his back, and looked Roy Baxter directly in the eye with an expression so calm and certain, it almost made Roy feel like he was the one being unreasonable. "For the woman who's going to live in it." Roy opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Ethan, buddy, you're not. Is there a woman?" "Not yet." Roy drove away that morning, shaking his head, and by noon he had told 4 people. By Thursday, the whole of Denton County knew that Ethan Caldwell had lost his mind. The thing people didn't understand about Ethan, the thing they never bothered to learn, was that he had always built things before he needed them. He built his workshop before he had any clients. He built his tool wall before he owned half the tools that hung on it. He built his root cellar the summer before the worst winter in 30 years, and when the roads closed and the power went out, and half the county was scrambling to survive, Ethan sat in his kitchen eating preserved food he had put up himself and thought quietly, "Good thing I didn't wait." He was not a man who believed in waiting for certainty before he began. He was a man who believed that sometimes you had to build the thing before the reason for it arrived. But even the people who knew him well, and there weren't many, had a hard time swallowing this one. Because this wasn't a root cellar. This was a home, with rooms, with windows chosen for their view of the sunrise, with a specific corner beside the fireplace that Ethan had redesigned 3 separate times because the light wasn't right and the light he told himself had to be right, with a garden bed already turned and composted and sitting empty in the cold, waiting for someone to plant what she wanted in it because he didn't know what she'd want, and it wasn't his place to decide. His friend Daniel, who had known Ethan since they were 15 years old, and had watched him be quietly strange his entire life without loving him any less. For it sat on the unfinished porch one evening in November with 2 bottles of beer and asked the question more carefully than Roy had. "Ethan," Daniel said, "I'm not laughing. I'm not judging. I'm asking you seriously, as someone who's known you for over 20 years. What are you actually doing here?" Ethan was quiet for a while. That was his way. He didn't rush his answers. He let things sit until they were ready. Finally, he said, "You know what I do when somebody hires me to build something for them? You build it. Before I build it, what do? Daniel thought about it. You ask them 100 questions they weren't expecting. I ask them what they need, Ethan said. Not what they want. Not what they think they should have. What they actually need. And then I build for that. He took a long drink of his beer. I've been thinking for a long time about what a woman who's spent her whole life building things for everyone else actually needs. And I think she needs somewhere that was built for her before she even knew she needed it. So she can walk in and not have to ask for anything. Daniel was quiet for a while. That's beautiful, man, he finally said. And also deeply weird. I know, Ethan said. How are you going to find her? Ethan looked out over the dark hillside. I put a letter out, he said. We'll see who answers. Odd. The letter had been Daniel's idea. Actually, though Ethan had resisted it for almost 4 months before he finally gave in. It wasn't an ad. Ethan was clear about that. He wouldn't call it an ad. He didn't want a dating profile. He didn't want some algorithm matching him based on his age and zip code and whether he preferred dogs or cats. What he wanted was words. Real ones. So what he wrote was not a list of his qualities or a description of his ideal match. What he wrote was a thought. Something he had been carrying around for a long time, heavy and quiet, the way you carry something you don't know what to do with yet. He wrote, I don't need someone to complete my life. I have a life. It's quieter than most people would want, and it's built around things that take patience, wood seasons land. What I want is someone who already has a life of her own. Someone who has been strong for so long, she's forgotten what it feels like to put the weight down. I'm not offering a rescue. I'm offering a second chair on a porch that only has one right now. If you know what that means, write back. Daniel had posted it to a small online community he was part of. People who wrote letters to each other, old-fashioned pen pal types, and then told Ethan to forget about it. That had been in early September. Ethan had more or less forgotten about it. He was 3 weeks into framing the exterior walls of the house when the first letter arrived. He almost didn't read it. Not because he didn't care he did deeply in the private way he cared about most things, but because he was in the middle of a complicated corner joint that required his full attention, and the envelope sat on his kitchen table for 2 full days before he picked it up. It was from a woman in Seattle. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She hadn't written much. 2 paragraphs. Clean, careful handwriting on plain white paper. She wrote, I read your letter 3 times before I decided to respond, and I'm still not sure I should. I'm an architect. I design homes for people who can afford to have everything. I'm good at it. I'm very, very good at understanding what people need in a space and giving it to them. And somewhere in the last 5 years, I stopped being able to remember the last time anyone thought about what I needed. I don't know why I'm telling you this. I don't usually tell anyone this. But your letter felt like something I wrote myself and forgot about. That second chair, I know exactly what that means. Clara. Ethan read it sitting at his kitchen table, his coffee going cold beside him. He read it a second time. Then he set it down, looked at the wall, and sat very still for a long time. When he finally stood up, he didn't go back to the job site. He went to his desk and he wrote back. So, he told her the truth. That surprised him actually how naturally the truth came out. Ethan was not a man who talked about himself easily. He had friends, but he had learned over the years to keep himself in the spaces between things, to show up when people needed him, and then recede quietly when they didn't. And he had gotten so good at this that there were people in Denton County who had known him for a decade and still couldn't tell you what he wanted out of life. But Clara Whitmore asked him a question in her first letter that nobody had ever thought to ask him. She asked, "What do you actually love? Not what are you good at? What do you love?" And Ethan wrote back 4 pages. He wrote about the way a piece of old-growth pine smells when you first cut into it like something that's been alive a long time and isn't finished yet. He wrote about the specific satisfaction of a corner joint so tight you couldn't slide a piece of paper through it, about how the first morning after a snowfall, when the whole world goes quiet and soft, and the trees hold the snow on their branches, like they're being careful with it, about how he'd sat on his porch 100 nights and thought that a view was almost unbearable to have alone. He wrote, "I lost my parents when I was 24. My mom first, my dad 2 years later. After that, I spent a long time believing that love was something that happened to other people. Not because I was unlucky, just because I was the kind of person who put himself last, and eventually you end up at the back of the line." He hesitated a long time before he added the last part. Then he added it anyway. "I built this house because I couldn't stand the idea of putting myself last anymore. I'm not sure what that makes me, maybe a little foolish, but the house is going up either way." Clara's next letter came in 11 days. She wrote 8 pages. She told him about the day she realized she had become exactly what she never wanted to be. A person who designed beautiful spaces for people who treated those spaces like trophies, who called her at 10 at night to ask whether the Italian marble was really the right choice, who confused the cost of a thing with its value, and never once asked her what she thought was beautiful. She told him about the apartment she lived in, which was stylish and clean and organized, and felt, she wrote, like a waiting room in a very expensive office building. She told him about her mother, who had died 2 years ago, and how grief was the loneliest thing she had ever experienced, because everyone around her kept telling her to be strong, and she didn't know how to explain that she had been strong her whole life. And she was tired, genuinely tired, all the way down to the bone. And then she wrote something that Ethan read and reread so many times, the paper started to wear along the fold lines. She wrote, "I designed a house last year for a couple in Bellevue. Beautiful house. 3 stories, guest rooms, a library. And when I handed over the final drawings, the wife squeezed my arm and said, 'You understand what a home needs to feel like.' And I smiled and thanked her and drove home and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes because I didn't know how to tell her that I had no idea. That I'd been faking it. That I'd been building the idea of home my whole career without knowing what it actually felt like from the inside. I wonder sometimes if the reason I'm so good at it is because I'm always working from the outside looking in." Ethan folded that letter carefully and put it in the top drawer of his desk. He went out to the job site and stood inside the unfinished walls of the house he was building and looked at the empty bedroom, the one with the shelf for books and the small desk and the chair he hadn't built yet, and felt something settle in his chest. Quiet and certain, the way good work feels when you know it's right. He picked up his hammer and went back to work. The letters went on. Every week, sometimes more. Sometimes less. Real life intervened on both ends, and there were stretches of 10 or 12 days where nothing came, and Ethan would wake up in the morning thinking about whether she was okay, in the same low-grade, worried way you think about someone who matters to you, even when you haven't said so yet. Because she was starting to matter to him. That was the thing that quietly astonished him. Not that he had feelings for a woman he'd never met, because he understood that feelings weren't always logical. What astonished him was how specific the feelings were. He didn't have a vague romantic notion of Clara Whitmore. He had a picture of her built out of 8 weeks of letters, and it was not a flattering idealization. He knew she was impatient with incompetence and struggled to hide it. He knew she had a habit of overworking herself until she crashed hard and then spent a weekend in bed feeling guilty about it. He knew she had a complicated relationship with the word deserve, that she helped everyone around her relentlessly and had deeply internalized the idea that she herself didn't quite merit the same care. He knew she could be funny. In a way, she seemed almost surprised by a sharp, dry, quick-moving humor that surfaced in her letters unpredictably, that could suddenly make him laugh out loud, sitting alone at his kitchen table in the dark. He knew she was afraid. Not of him. She had never expressed fear of him specifically, but afraid in the way that people who have been disappointed enough times become afraid not of the fall itself, but of having gotten their hopes up before it. One night in January, when a hard freeze had kept him indoors for 3 days running, he sat by his own fireplace and wrote her this: "Clara, I need to tell you something, and I'm going to say it plainly because I've learned that I don't do well when I try to be subtle. I am building this house, and I am thinking about you while I build it. Not constantly. I'm not a teenager. I know how to work, but the way you think about something that's become real to you. The corner bedroom has the morning light because you said once that mornings are the only time you feel like yourself, and I remembered that. I don't know what this is. I'm not putting a name on it. I'm just telling you it's real. You don't have to say anything back. I just thought you should know. He mailed it before he could change his mind. Her response took 16 days, the longest silence between them since they'd started writing. When it finally came, it was just one paragraph. Ethan, the morning light in that corner, that's the thing that undoes me. Not the house, not the effort. That one detail. That you remembered that, and then built it quietly, without making it into a gift that required a thank you. That's not something I know how to explain to someone who hasn't been waiting to feel known for a very long time. I'm scared. I want you to know that I'm scared. And I'm coming to Montana in April. Clara. When Roy Baxter saw Ethan planting flowers along the front path in early March, kneeling in the mud in the cold, pressing bulbs into the soil with his bare hands, fingers black with earth, he stopped his truck again. "Are you seriously planting flowers for this woman?" Roy called out the window. Ethan didn't look up. "Tulips," he said. "They'll be up by April if the frost breaks right." Roy stared at him. "Ethan, you have never planted a single flower in your life. I have known you since we were in the same third-grade classroom. You have never once." "I know." "What happens if she doesn't come?" Ethan sat back on his heels and looked down at the dark earth in front of him. "Then I'll have flowers," he said. Roy sat in his truck for a moment with the engine idling. Then he turned it off, got out, crouched down next to Ethan in the mud. "Where do you want the next row?" he said. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Something moved across his face that Roy would describe later when people asked him about it as the closest thing to vulnerable he had ever seen on a man who kept everything locked down so tight. "Here," Ethan said, and handed him a bulb. They planted for 2 hours without saying much of anything. That was the thing about Roy. He laughed first always, but he showed up second, and he never left early. Daniel came out to the house in late March when it was nearly finished. He walked through every room without saying a word. Through the kitchen with its wide plank floors and the window over the sink that looked out over the hills. Through the living room with the fireplace and the reading corner and the 2 armchairs. Because Ethan had thought about one armchair and then thought about Clara reading while he read and couldn't do it, couldn't put one chair in there. It felt wrong. It felt like he was still planning for aloneness. Through the hallway, with the built-in shelves that lined both walls, floor to ceiling, empty waiting. Through the corner bedroom. Daniel stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time. The morning light was already starting to come through the east-facing window. Even at the late hour they'd arrived, the last of it cutting a long, pale stripe across the wooden floor. The small desk sat beside the window, the handmade chair beside the desk. The bookshelves lined the wall behind, empty. Nothing else. No decoration, no softening gesture, just exactly what that room needed, and nothing more. "Ethan," Daniel said finally. "Yeah. What if she walks in here and she doesn't feel it?" Ethan was quiet for a beat. "She'll feel it," he said. "How do you know?" Ethan leaned against the doorframe and looked at the room. "Because I felt it when I built it," he said. "And I built it for her." Daniel nodded slowly. He looked at the stripe of light on the floor. He looked at the chair by the window. "You're not foolish," Daniel said. "I need to take that back. What I said in November, I need to take it back." Ethan shook his head. "You don't." "I do. Because this—" Daniel gestured at the room, at the whole house around them. "This isn't crazy. This is the sanest thing I've ever seen a person do. You're not building this because you're afraid of being alone. You're building it because you already decided to love someone generously before you knew who it was going to be." Ethan looked at him. "Don't make it too poetic," he said. "I also just really like building things." Daniel laughed, a real one, the kind that fills a room. And for a moment, in that empty house on a cold Montana hillside, the rooms didn't feel empty at all. April came in hard and then softened. The tulips came up, red and yellow just like Ethan had wanted, though he wouldn't have admitted to caring about the color. The house was finished on the 14th of April. Ethan stood outside it in the early morning, the air cold and clean and smelling of pine, and the particular freshness that comes after the last snow of the season. He looked at the wooden sign he had installed beside the front path. No name on it, just a small carved shape, a bird in flight wings, spread the kind of thing you might not notice unless you were looking for it. He had almost put a name on the sign. He'd picked up the chisel 3 separate times and then set it back down, because the name on the sign was a decision that wasn't only his to make. If she came, and she was coming, her last letter had said she would arrive on the 17th. She had booked the flight. She had taken the time off. She was coming, then the name on that sign would be hers to choose. He wasn't going to name a home for someone who hadn't lived in it yet. He went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in almost 8 months, he didn't go out to work on something. He just sat, in the house he had built, and waited for it to become a home. Tch. On the evening of April 16th, the night before Clara was supposed to arrive, Roy Baxter called him. "You nervous?" Roy asked. "Yes," Ethan said, which surprised him. He hadn't planned to admit it. "What are you nervous about?" Ethan thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. He was nervous the way you're nervous before something that can't be undone. Not afraid of it going wrong exactly, but aware that it was going to change things permanently either way, and that the version of himself that existed right now in this house on this night was the last version that wouldn't know. "I don't know what to say to her," he finally said. "When she gets here, I've written her 100 letters, and I don't know what I'm going to say when she's standing in front of me." Roy was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to say anything," Roy said. "Let her see it first. The house, all of it, the tulips, the sign, that bedroom you worked on for 4 months. Let her see it before you say a word. Because Ethan—" Roy paused. "You already said everything. You said it in wood and glass and the light in that bedroom window. You don't have to repeat yourself." Ethan was quiet. "When did you get smart?" he finally said. "I've always been smart," Roy said. "You just never asked." Shh. He didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake and thought about the sequence of events that had led him here to this house, to these letters, to the morning that was coming, and he tried to locate the moment where things had turned. Where his life, which had been a long and largely solitary thing, had begun moving in a direction he hadn't expected. He kept coming back to the same moment, not the letter he'd written, not the first response from Clara, not even the night he'd read her 8-page letter by the fire and felt something loosen in his chest. He kept coming back to the morning over a year ago now, when he'd woken up at 4 in the morning from a dream he couldn't remember and walked out to the piece of ground behind his workshop in the dark and just stood there. Not thinking anything in particular, just standing there. And known in the way, you know things that don't come from logic, that this was the place, that he was going to build something here, that it wasn't going to be for him. He had stood there in the dark for almost an hour before he went back inside, and in the morning he had started drawing up the plans. He hadn't questioned it since. Maybe that was the thing the neighbors would never understand. He thought, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Not the letter. Not the months of writing. Not even the house itself. The part they'd never understand was that he had been certain quietly and completely from before it started. That the certainty wasn't arrogance. It was faith. Not in fate, not in some sentimental idea about love waiting around the corner. Faith in the idea that if you built something real, if you put care and intention and honesty into something, if you built it not to impress anyone, but because it was right, because it was needed, because somewhere in you knew it was true, then the thing would eventually find what it was built for. He believed that the way he believed in wood and weather and the patience of seasons. He fell asleep sometime before dawn, and in the morning she came. She arrived at 11:47 in the morning. He knew the exact time because he looked at the clock when he heard the car on the gravel road, and the numbers locked themselves into him, the way certain moments do. The way you know, even while something is happening, that you are going to remember the exact shape of it for the rest of your life. He was standing outside. Roy had offered to be there. Daniel had offered to be there. He had told them both gently and without discussion that he needed this to be quiet. So it was quiet. Just the wind in the pines and the crunch of gravel and the white car that came slowly around the bend and stopped. Ethan stood very still. The door opened, and Clara Whitmore stepped out. She was taller than he'd imagined. That was the first thing he noticed. Not her face, not her expression, just that she was taller. And she moved the way people move when they're used to walking into rooms and immediately assessing them, her head up, her eyes moving quickly, taking in everything around her. But then the eyes stopped moving. She was looking at the house. Ethan stood there, and he did not say a word. She looked at the front path with the tulips on both sides, red and yellow, exactly right. She looked at the small wooden sign with the carved bird in flight. She looked at the wide porch with the two chairs. She stopped there for a moment on the two chairs, and something happened in her face that Ethan couldn't quite read from where he was standing, but that he thought later might have been the expression of a person who has been holding something in for a very long time, and suddenly feels the first crack form. Then she walked, slowly, toward the front door. She didn't look at him. Not yet. He didn't reach for the door, didn't offer to open it, didn't speak. He just waited. She reached the door and put her hand on it and paused, and then she turned to look at him. Her face was he would never quite find the words for this later when people asked him to describe the moment. He would say something inadequate like, "She looked real," and people would laugh, and he would mean something much more specific than that. He would mean that she looked like someone who had, in the space of 30 seconds, stopped performing and become entirely herself. No presentation, no careful management of expression, no professional warmth. Just Clara. She looked at him for a long moment. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "You built the only place in the world," she said, "where I finally feel like I can stop pretending." Ethan stood completely still. He had imagined this moment 100 times, had imagined what she might say, had imagined his own response, had imagined every version of this first face-to-face exchange as a kind of preparation, the way you prepare for the thing you care most about. But he hadn't prepared for this. He hadn't prepared for the truth. Because those weren't the words of someone who was impressed by good craftsmanship or touched by a romantic gesture. He had heard both of those things in his life, and he knew what they sounded like. Those were the words of someone who had been carrying something very heavy alone for a very long time, and had just for the first time felt it lift. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He walked to the door, opened it and stepped back, and Clara Whitmore walked into the home that had been waiting for her. She stood inside the front door for a long time without moving. Ethan stayed back. He understood in the way he understood most things quietly, without needing it explained that this was not a moment that required him. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't waiting for him to speak. She was standing inside the threshold of something she hadn't expected to feel, and she needed a minute with it before she had to be a person again. He watched her breathe. He watched her press one hand against the doorframe just for a second, like she was checking that it was real. And then she turned around and looked at him with an expression that was completely unguarded, completely undefended, the kind of expression that most people only let out when they believe no one is watching. "How?" she said. Just that. One word. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "How what?" "How did you know?" she said. "The light, the shelves, that chair." She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "I haven't told anyone, not my colleagues, not my friends, not a single person in my life, that the thing I want most in the world is a chair by a window where I can write and nobody needs anything from me. I haven't said that out loud, not once. How did you build something I never told you I needed?" Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You told me," he said. "I didn't." "Third letter," he said. You wrote that the only hour of your day that felt like yours was 5 in the morning before the city woke up. You said you'd stand at your window in the dark and think about the things you'd write someday if you ever had the time. You said the problem wasn't time. You said the problem was that you'd never had a place that felt like it was waiting for the words instead of rushing past them. Clara stared at him. You remembered that. I remember all of it, he said, simply, without drama, the way you say a thing that is just true. She looked away. Back at the room. Her jaw moved slightly, and she didn't say anything for a moment, and Ethan could see her doing the thing he'd come to recognize in her letters, the thing she did when something hit her hard, and her instinct was to manage it, to process it privately, to fold it up and put it somewhere safe before it got out. Clara, he said. She looked at him. You don't have to hold it together in here, he said. That's kind of the whole point of the place. She laughed. It came out fast and startled, and a little wet at the edges. Not elegant, not composed, just genuinely funny, in the way that moments are funny when you're also about to cry. And then her eyes did fill up, and she blinked hard, and looked at the ceiling, and after a moment she said, I'm sorry, I don't. I'm not a crier. I want you to know that up front. Okay, he said. I haven't cried in front of someone in probably 4 years. You're not crying, he said. You're just leaking a little. She laughed again, harder this time, and pressed the back of her wrist against her eye, and when she looked back at him, her face was different. Something had shifted. The last layer of performance had dropped away, and what was underneath was just a woman who was 31 years old and exhausted in a bone-deep way, and hadn't known until this precise moment exactly how much she'd needed somewhere to land. Okay, she said. Show me everything. So he did. He walked her through the house the way he'd built it, without hurry, without commentary, without explaining everything. Some things he let her discover. The way the kitchen window framed the hill. The particular depth of the bookshelves, deep enough for 2 rows of books, because he'd thought about the way she described her reading habits. Layers deep, always 5 books going at once. The fireplace with the wide stone hearth built so that 2 people could sit on it, comfortably facing each other, which was something you didn't see much anymore, and that he had put in deliberately quietly, without making a thing of it. She noticed all of it. She didn't say much. She touched things. She ran her hand along the edge of a shelf, crouched down to look at how the hearthstones met the floor, pressed her palm flat against the window glass in the hallway, and held it there like she was taking the temperature of it. She was assessing, he realized. Not the way she'd assessed buildings professionally for a decade, not with the calculating part of her brain that knew load-bearing walls and sightlines and resale value. She was assessing it the way you assess whether something is safe, whether you can trust it, whether it's going to hold. He let her assess. They reached the corner bedroom last. She stopped in the doorway. Morning light was coming in now at a low angle, the kind that comes after noon, when it starts its long decline, different from the early brightness but still warm. The stripe on the floor was shorter, softer. The chair by the window was still. Clara stood in the doorway and did not move for almost a full minute. Ethan stood behind her and let the room do what it was built to do. Finally, she said very quietly, "Did you think about me when you built this one?" "Yes," he said. Specifically. She was quiet for another moment. Then, "What did you think?" He considered the question. He wasn't a man who answered things carelessly. "I thought about the part in your letter," he said, "where you wrote about your mother, about sitting beside her hospital bed in the last week and not being able to stop working. You had your laptop out and you were revising blueprints because you didn't know what to do with your hands, and you said you've regretted it ever since, not being able to just sit with her without needing something to do. I built this room so that if you ever needed to just sit, there'd be somewhere that made it feel okay to do that. Not productive, not efficient, just okay." Clara turned around. Her face had done the thing again, that wide-open, undefended thing, but this time she didn't try to put it back. "That's not something a stranger does," she said. "No," he agreed. "We're not strangers, are we?" she said. It wasn't a question. "We haven't been for a while," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Outside, the wind moved in the pines, and somewhere in the distance a bird called twice and stopped. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had already said the important things and were now just catching up to them in person. "I'm going to need coffee," Clara said finally. "Kitchen's behind you," Ethan said. "I know where the kitchen is," she said. "I'm an architect. I have an excellent sense of spatial layout." She paused. "Will you make it, though I have a feeling yours is better than mine?" He went and made the coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he had read her first letter, where he had written back 4 pages about what he loved, where he had sat alone for months with her words and his thoughts, and the slow accumulation of something he couldn't name. And she put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. "Ethan," she said while his back was to her. "Yeah. I need to tell you something that I should have said in a letter but couldn't figure out how to write." He turned around, looked at her. "I almost didn't come," she said. He was quiet. He put the coffee down and sat across from her. "I booked the flight 3 times, she said, "and canceled it twice. My colleague Jen, she's the only person I told about any of this. She sat in my office 2 weeks ago and said, 'Clara, what exactly are you afraid of?' And I told her I wasn't afraid of it, not working out. I told her that was manageable. I've had things not work out." She looked at her hands on the table. "I told her I was afraid of it working out," she said, "because if it works out, then I've spent the last 6 years building the wrong life. And I don't know what to do with that." The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Can I tell you what I think?" he said. "Please," she said. "I think you didn't build the wrong life," he said. "I think you built a life that was exactly right for the person you had to be at the time. And then you outgrew it. That's not failure. That's just what happens, if you're growing." She looked up at him. "When did you get wise?" she said. "I'm not wise," he said. "I just build things for a living, and I've noticed that the best buildings are the ones that change over time, that were built to be added to, not finished, just started right." She stared at him. "You just compared me to a building," she said. "I did," he said. "I apologize." "Don't," she said. "It's the nicest thing anyone said to me in years." They sat with their coffee, and they talked, and the afternoon moved around them the way afternoons do in Montana, slow and wide and full of light, and the house did what Ethan had built it to do. It held them. It didn't interrupt. It didn't demand. It just stayed quiet around the edges of their conversation and let them fill it. That was when it started to get complicated. Not between them. Not exactly. Something else. Clara's phone rang at 3:30. She looked at the screen, and her whole body changed. Shoulders pulled and jaw set. The professional armor clicking back into place so fast it almost gave Ethan whiplash. She looked up at him. "I have to take this. I'm sorry." "Take it," he said. She stepped toward the window and answered. He didn't mean to listen, but the kitchen wasn't large and she wasn't quiet. "Martin," she said, "I told you I was unavailable this week." A pause. That's not what I agreed to. That's what you decided." Another pause longer. Her hand went to her forehead. "Martin, I am in Montana. I cannot have this conversation right now." Her voice was controlled but tight, the way a wire gets tight before it breaks. "Because I am a person and not a resource, and I told you 3 weeks ago that I needed this week. Yes, that's what I said. I'm going to hang up now." She hung up. She stood with her back to Ethan for a moment. Then she turned around, and her face was composed again except around the eyes where the tiredness lived and wouldn't quite go away. "My boss," she said, "I gathered. I have a client presentation due Monday that he apparently decided I'm going to present in person, which requires me to be in Seattle on Sunday, which requires me to—" She stopped herself. Her hands were braced on the kitchen counter. "You know what? It's fine. I'll deal with it." Ethan looked at her steadily. Is it fine? It will be. That's not what I asked. She looked at him sharply. Not angry, more like she was surprised to be pushed back on, like it didn't happen often. No, she said. It's not fine. It's the third time this month he's changed the terms of something I specifically arranged. And every time I deal with it instead of pushing back because I've spent 10 years building a reputation for being reliable. And I don't know how to be reliable and have boundaries at the same time. She said it fast, like she'd been holding it at high pressure and the valve had given. You could say no, Ethan said. I know I could say no. Have you? She opened her mouth, closed it. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. You haven't, he said. It's more complicated than... I'm not judging, he said. I'm not. I know it's complicated. I know what it costs to be the person who always delivers when everyone's counting on you to deliver. My dad was that person. My whole childhood he was that person. And he was good at his job, and he was reliable, and he was respected. And he also missed about 40% of the moments that mattered because the job knew it could call and he'd pick up. Clara was very still. I'm not your dad, she said, but gently. No, Ethan said. But I'm watching someone who flew to Montana, which is not easy. It's not convenient. It took something to get on that plane, and who was finally for about 3 hours just a person. And then a phone rang, and she started turning back into a job title. Something moved across Clara's face. She set her phone face down on the counter. I hear you, she said. I know you do. I'm not going to fix it in one afternoon. I know that too. But I'm not picking up if he calls again today. That's a start, Ethan said. She looked at him for a moment with something that was complicated to read, gratitude maybe, but also something wary, the look of a person deciding whether they trust the ground they're standing on, whether it'll hold. You're not going to let me perform, are you? She said. Not if I can help it, he said. She nodded once slowly. That's going to take some getting used to, she said. He got up and refilled her coffee without being asked. That night, Ethan had arranged for Clara to stay in town at the small bed and breakfast on Miller Road run by a woman named Grace, who could be trusted absolutely to be warm and discreet and not ask too many questions. He'd thought about the alternative about her staying in the house and had decided against it without much deliberation. Not because of propriety, but because he wanted her first night in Denton County to feel chosen, not presumed. He drove her into town himself. They were quiet in this truck for most of the ride, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that starts to build between people who are no longer managing the first awkwardness and haven't yet reached the second harder kind. Halfway to town, Clara said, the sign by the path, the bird. Yeah, he said. Why no name? He kept his eyes on the road. Because it's not my name to put on it. She turned to look at him. In the low light of the truck, he couldn't see her expression well, but he felt her looking. You assumed I'd want my name on it, she said. I assumed whoever lived there would want their name on it, he said. And I didn't know yet whose name that was going to be. Quiet again. A long bend in the road. Pine trees catching the last light. Clara, she said. What? My name, she said. In case you're carving a sign soon, and you need to know how it's spelled. He looked over at her. She was looking straight ahead, and there was a small smile at the corner of her mouth that she was trying not to show, and Ethan felt something expand in his chest so fast it almost hurt. Clara, he said. I know how it's spelled. I've written it about 200 times. Just making sure, she said. He dropped her at Grace's and watched her walk to the door, and when she reached it, she turned around and looked back at him with an expression he didn't have a name for yet, and he thought that maybe some things you didn't need to name right away. Maybe some things you just needed to let be what they were while they were being it. He drove home with both windows down despite the cold. He walked into the house and stood in the kitchen and looked at the 2 coffee cups still on the table. And for the first time in 11 years, the quiet of the house didn't feel like absence. It felt like the pause between sentences, something that was part of the story not outside it. He washed the cups, turned off the light, went to bed. He did not sleep right away. He lay in the dark and thought about the look on Clara's face when she'd stood in the corner bedroom. The way she'd said you built the only place in the world. He thought about the phone call from her boss, and the way she'd come back from it, like someone stepping back into a coat they'd already decided they were done wearing but hadn't figured out how to take off yet. He thought she's going to go back, not because she wanted to, not because she chose it freely, but because the shape of her life in Seattle was deep and grooved, and you didn't step out of something like that in a single afternoon, no matter how right the afternoon was. He knew this. He'd been prepared for it in the abstract way you prepare for outcomes you don't want, but that you respect enough to account for. What he hadn't prepared for was how much it would matter. Because somewhere between the letters and the light in that bedroom and the coffee and the small smile in the truck he had crossed a line that he hadn't realized he was approaching. He had stopped building a house for a woman he'd never met. He had started caring about this specific woman with her specific exhaustion and her specific bravery and her specific way of almost not crying, and then pulling herself together with a wry comment that made him laugh, and the specificity of it was both wonderful and terrifying. Because specificity meant stakes. He rolled onto his back and looked at the ceiling. "Okay," he said to nobody. Then he closed his eyes. In the morning, he was going to make breakfast. He was going to pick her up from Grace's at 9, and he was going to show her the land, and he was going to let her decide what she thought of it. And he was not going to push or lean or make her feel obligated or cornered. He was going to let her be free. And he was going to hope that free led her back. He was still thinking about this when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text. From Clara. Timestamp 11:48 p.m. He read it. She wrote, "I'm lying here in Grace's very comfortable bed listening to how quiet it is, and I can't sleep. I keep thinking about what you said about my dad. I mean, about your dad, about the phone calls. And I need to tell you something that I've never told anyone. I didn't stop working when my mother was dying because I was heartless. I stopped feeling things for about 6 months after she died, and I worked through all of it because work was the only thing that was still real to me. The house you built when I walked in today was the first thing in 2 years that felt more real than work. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. But I needed to tell you. Good night, Ethan." He read it twice. He set the phone down. He picked it up again. He wrote back, "You're not supposed to do anything with it. You're just supposed to have it. Good night, Clara." He set the phone on the nightstand and lay there in the dark house and listened to the pines. 3 minutes later, she replied. One word. "Thank you." He turned off the lamp. Outside, the Montana night was deep and clear and full of stars. The kind of sky that only comes when you're far enough from everything that the dark has room to be real. The tulips were closed in the garden, the sign was standing at the front path, and the house on the hillside was quiet, holding everything it had been built to hold. The second chair on the porch stood empty, but for the first time since Ethan had put it there, it didn't feel like it was waiting. It felt like it was resting, because the person it was waiting for wasn't somewhere far away anymore. She was 11 minutes down the road, lying awake in the dark, texting back. And that for now was more than enough. He would learn in the morning what came next. He would learn whether she called her boss back or whether she let it ring. He would learn whether the daylight version of her rested clear-eyed back on solid ground still felt what she'd felt the afternoon before, or whether the professional armor would come back up and make everything that had happened feel slightly distant and dreamlike the way important things sometimes did in the light of day. He didn't know. He was learning to be okay with not knowing. But there was one thing. One thing he had felt when she'd stood in that corner bedroom doorway, one thing he'd heard in her voice when she said, "You built the only place in the world that he was not going to second guess." She hadn't said that about the design. She hadn't said it about the craftsmanship. She'd said it about how it felt to be inside it. And that was the thing Ethan had built for from the very first morning he'd stood on that piece of ground in the dark and known. Not a house. A feeling. A specific feeling for a specific woman that said, "You can stop now." You're here. You don't have to carry this anymore. He had built it before she existed to him as anything more than a possibility, and she had walked in and felt it in the first 30 seconds. Everything else, the hard parts, the complicated parts, the parts that would take time and negotiation, and the slow, unglamorous work of two people learning each other's rhythms, all of that was still ahead of them. But that part, the part he'd built toward, the reason the whole thing had started on a dark morning 11 months ago, with a man standing on empty ground and knowing that part had worked, and lying in the dark with the pines moving outside Ethan Caldwell, who had been called foolish and strange and lonely, who had built a home for a woman before she arrived, who had planted tulips in the mud and put a bird on a sign and left the name blank because it wasn't his name to put there. Smiled. It was a small smile. Not triumphant, not relieved exactly. Just the particular quiet kind that comes when a thing you built with your hands and your patience and your whole stubborn heart turns out in the end to have been built right. She called Martin back. Ethan found out at breakfast, not because she told him right away, but because he could see it in how she held herself when he picked her up from Grace's at 9. The night before, something in her had loosened. She'd texted him at midnight, and it had been real and unguarded and soft at the edges. But the woman who walked out of Grace's front door at 9 in the morning was carrying something again. He could see it the way a carpenter sees a crack in a wall. Not dramatic, not obvious to everyone, but there, if you knew what to look for. She smiled when she got in the truck. It was a real smile, not a performance. But something was sitting behind it. He waited until they were back at the house, until the coffee was made, and she was at the kitchen table before he said anything. "You called him," Ethan said. Clara looked up. A beat of surprise. Then she put her cup down. "How did you know you're carrying something?" he said. "Last night you weren't." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. "He called at 7 this morning," she said. "Grace's room has terrible cell service, so it probably rang 6 times before I even heard it. And I picked up because I don't know why. Habit. 10 years of habit." "What did he say?" "He said the client specifically requested me for the Sunday presentation. That it wasn't his decision." She paused. "Which might be true. Marcus Chen, the client, he's particular. He doesn't like surprises, and he doesn't like substitutes." "And what did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." She looked at Ethan steadily. "Before you say anything, I know. I know what it sounds like." "I wasn't going to say anything. You were thinking it loud enough that I could hear it." He almost smiled. "What was I thinking? That I spent 2 days psyching myself up to get on a plane to Montana, and I've been here less than 24 hours, and I'm already negotiating my way back out." She picked up her coffee, set it back down without drinking. "And you'd be right. That's exactly what I'm doing." "Is that what you want?" he said. "To go back?" "No," she said immediately. "Then, yes. I don't know. I want to not be the kind of person who gets pulled back every time." She pushed her cup a few inches away from her, a small frustrated gesture. But wanting that and being that are different things. "How long were you planning to stay?" he asked. "A week," she said. "That was the plan." "Is the plan still a week?" She looked at him directly. "I don't know." That was honest, and he respected it, even as something in his chest pulled tight. He didn't push it. He got up and put 2 pieces of bread in the toaster because he needed something to do with his hands, and he stood with his back to her for a moment and breathed. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. A slight edge of surprise in her voice, like she'd been waiting for an argument. "Okay," he said again. "You don't know yet. That's an honest answer. I'm not going to push you toward a decision you haven't made yet." He turned around. "But while you're figuring it out, do you want to see the land, all of it, not just the house?" She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I do." He handed her a piece of toast. She took it. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for not fighting me on it." "I wasn't going to fight you on it. Most people would have." "I'm not most people," he said. "No," she agreed. You really are not. They ate quickly and went outside, and Ethan took her across the property the same way he'd walked it the first time himself, not with a plan, just moving and letting the land speak. He showed her where the creek ran in spring frozen now, but you could still hear it underneath if you were quiet. He showed her the ridge where you could see 3 mountain ranges at once on a clear day. He showed her the old apple trees at the back of the property planted decades before he'd bought the land, gnarled and thick, and producing more fruit every fall than one person could reasonably use. Clara walked beside him, and she asked questions. Real ones, the kind that showed she was thinking, not just being polite. She asked about the soil, the water table, the access road in winter. She asked who his neighbors were, and how far the nearest town was, and what happened when something broke and you needed a specialist. He answered all of it, directly without selling it to her. He told her the access road iced up bad in January and February, and there had been 2 winters where he'd been effectively cut off for a week at a time. He told her the nearest hospital was 40 minutes in good conditions and longer in bad ones. He told her that the isolation was real, that some days in winter the silence was the best thing in the world, and other days it pressed in on you like a physical weight, and you had to make a point of getting in the truck and driving to Roy's just to hear another voice. He told her the truth because she deserved the truth, because she wasn't someone who needed to be sold something. She was an architect who had spent a decade looking at spaces and seeing through them, and if he tried to package this place as something perfect, she'd see the packaging and lose trust in everything else. So he told her the truth, and she listened to all of it, and at the end, standing on the ridge with the wind coming in off the mountains, she said, "It's harder than I thought it would be to imagine leaving this." He looked at her. "Montana." "This," she said, and made a small gesture that seemed to mean everything, the land, the house behind them, him. The wind moved between them. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Clara's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Her face changed. "Who is it?" Ethan said. She turned the screen toward him. One word, Martin. They looked at each other. She let it ring. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. The silence after it stopped was the loudest thing Ethan had heard in a while. "Okay," Clara said almost to herself. "Okay." "How does that feel?" he said. "Terrifying," she said. "And like the first right thing I've done in a month." They stood on the ridge for another few minutes before they went back down, and something had shifted between them again, not big and obvious, but the kind of shift that matters, the kind that builds like snowpack, one quiet layer at a time. That afternoon, Roy showed up. Ethan had not told Roy to come, but Roy had what he called a 6th sense for significant moments in his friends' lives, which his wife described more precisely as nosiness, and sure enough, at 2 in the afternoon, his truck appeared on the gravel road. Ethan saw him coming and felt something complicated. Roy was his oldest friend, and also the person most likely to say something that landed wrong, not from malice, but from a lifelong habit of charging at things directly without checking first whether the door was open. But he was already out of the truck. "Roy," Ethan said, stepping toward him, dropping his voice. "I'm going to ask you to be on your best behavior." Roy looked offended. "I'm always on my best behavior." "You are never on your best behavior. You are usually on your second best behavior, which is fine most of the time. Today I need your best." "Is she here?" "She's inside." Roy straightened his collar. Actually straightened his collar, which he didn't have one of because he was wearing a flannel shirt, so it was a strange gesture. "I'll be good," he said. "I just want to meet her." "I know. I planted those tulips," Roy said. "I feel like I have a stake in this." "You planted 6 bulbs," Ethan said, "in 2 rows. 6 important bulbs." Ethan looked at him for a moment and decided there was nothing to be done about Roy Baxter when he'd decided to do something. There never had been. They went inside. Clara was in the living room. She had apparently pulled one of the books off the shelf that Ethan had stocked. He'd bought books based on what she'd mentioned. Loving another detail she probably hadn't realized she'd given him, and she was sitting in one of the armchairs with her legs tucked under her reading, and she looked so entirely at home that for a second Ethan just stood in the doorway and looked at her and felt the floor shift slightly under him. She looked up. "Roy Baxter," Roy said, immediately extending his hand. "I'm Ethan's best friend. I also planted 6 of those tulips out front." Clara shook his hand. A smile moved across her face that was genuine and slightly amused. "Clara Whitmore, how long have you known him?" "Since 3rd grade," Roy said. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was very Roy. "I was the first person to find out he was building this place. I thought he'd gone absolutely insane." "Roy," Ethan said. "She should know this," Roy said. "She should know that I stood right over there." He pointed at the kitchen doorway and told him he was building a house for a ghost. And he looked at me and said, "Then I'll have a nice house." Like that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. Clara looked at Ethan. "Is that what you said?" "More or less," Ethan said. "I told him he was crazy," Roy said. "I want you to know that I retract that, because right now I'm sitting in this house and you're in it, and I would like the record to reflect that I am capable of being wrong." Clara laughed a full one, the kind that filled the room, and Roy looked delighted, and Ethan crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe and thought, despite himself, that Roy had maybe earned the 6 tulips. "He talked about you," Roy said. "Not constantly, not in a weird way. But when I'd ask him what he was working on, sometimes he'd tell me what he was building and why, and it was always because of something you'd said, something in a letter. I want you to know that too." Clara's smile softened. She looked at Ethan. "The morning light in the corner bedroom," she said. "He told you," Roy said. "I figured it out." Roy nodded. He looked at Ethan, then back at Clara. Then he stood up. "I'm going to go," he said. "I just wanted to see for myself." "See what?" Clara said. "Whether you were real," Roy said simply. "Whether he was right." He picked up his jacket from where he'd slung it over the chair back. "He was right. He's annoyingly often right. Don't tell him I said that." He walked to the door, stopped, turned back around. "One more thing," he said. He was looking at Clara, and his voice was different now, quieter. The flannel and truck exterior dropped a layer. "He's been alone a long time. Not because nobody wanted him around. Because he chose it, because he's the kind of man who doesn't do things halfway, and he wasn't ready to not do this halfway. So what I want to say is, he's not going to make it easy to do anything small here. He doesn't know how to do things small." A pause. "I think you probably already know that, but I wanted to say it." The room was very still. Clara looked at Roy for a moment. "I know it," she said. "That's why I got on the plane." Roy nodded once, looked at Ethan. Something passed between them that was 11 years old and didn't need words. Then he left. The truck crunched down the gravel road and faded out. "I like him," Clara said. "He's a lot," Ethan said. "He loves you." "I know." Ethan uncrossed his arms. "He's the one who talked me into posting the letter." Clara stared at him. "Roy talked you into it." "Daniel suggested it. Roy made me actually do it." "So, Roy is technically responsible for all of this." "Don't tell him that either," Ethan said. "His head is already barely fitting through the door." She laughed again, and he sat down in the other armchair, and outside the afternoon was deepening toward evening, and neither of them said anything for a minute, and it was one of those silences that isn't empty, that has texture and warmth, and the particular quality of two people comfortable enough with each other to not need to fill it. Then Clara said, "I need to tell you something." Her voice had changed. The lightness was still there underneath, but something had come to the surface. Ethan looked at her, waited. "I talked to Jen this morning," she said, "before you picked me up, my colleague, the one who knew about this." "What did she say?" Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. "She said Martin called her. Not about the Sunday presentation, about me." She paused. "He told her that if I wasn't back by Friday, he was going to reassign the Chen account to David Park." Ethan was still. The Chen account is 4 years of my work, Clara said. It's not just a project. It's the project that was supposed to represent everything I've been building toward professionally. The design I'm most proud of. The client who actually trusted me to do something real, not just expensive. Her voice had gone careful and controlled the way voices go when you're keeping something from showing. If he reassigns it, it's not just losing a job. It's losing the version of the last 4 years that had a point. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. When do you have to decide? He said. Martin wants an answer by tomorrow morning, she said. What does Jen think you should do? She thinks I should go back. A pause. She also thinks I should have left that job 2 years ago. Both things can be true. What do you think? Clara looked at the window. At the light coming through it, the same angle it had been at yesterday when she'd stood in this house for the first time and put her hand on the door frame, like she was checking if it was real. I think, she said slowly, that I am sitting in a house that a man built for me before he knew my name. And my boss is calling me back to protect a project that, if I'm honest with myself, has been the main thing keeping me from admitting how miserable I've been. She turned to look at Ethan. And I think that if I get in a car tomorrow and drive to the airport, I am going to spend the entire flight telling myself it was the practical decision. And I'm going to be right. And I'm going to hate being right. Ethan didn't move. He let her say it all. And I think, she said, that I don't know what the right answer is, which is new for me. I usually know what the right answer is. What's the right answer usually? He said. The one that keeps the most options open, she said. The one that's hardest to regret. And right now, she looked at him for a long moment. Right now, both answers feel like they close something, she said. If I leave, I close this before it's had a real chance. If I stay, I might lose the thing that has been the anchor of my professional identity for 4 years. She shook her head slightly. I hate ultimatums. Martin is giving you an ultimatum, Ethan said. Not me. I need you to know that. Whatever you decide, it doesn't change anything here. The house is here. I'm here. He stopped. I'm not going anywhere, Clara. She looked at him, and her eyes did the thing they'd done the day before, filled up quick and unwilling, and she blinked it back. You can't say things like that, she said. Why not? Because it makes the decision harder. Good, he said. She blinked. Good. It should be hard, he said. It means both things matter. If it was easy, you'd either not care about the job or not care about... He stopped. About this. The word this sat between them like something physical. Clara took a breath. Let it out slowly. I'm going to call Martin, she said. Ethan watched her. I'm going to tell him, she said, that I will present the Chen account on Monday remotely from here, using the same system I've used for every remote presentation for the last 3 years that he never had a problem with, until it stopped being convenient for him. And if he says no, her jaw was set, the same jaw he'd seen tighten on the phone yesterday, but different now, not controlled, not managed, decided. Then I'll tell him that 4 years of work means I've earned the right to define the terms of one presentation, she said, and if he disagrees, then I'll have learned something important about what my last 4 years were actually worth to him. Ethan was quiet for a beat. You're sure? He said. No, she said, but I'm doing it anyway. She called Martin from the kitchen while Ethan stayed in the living room. He could hear the tone of her voice, but not the words, steady, direct. No apology in the architecture of it, and it lasted 7 minutes exactly. He watched the clock on the wall without meaning to. When she came back in, she sat down in the armchair. He agreed, she said. Remote presentation Monday. He's not happy. He made sure I knew he wasn't happy. How do you feel? Ethan said. Like I should have done that 2 years ago, she said. But today you did it. Today I did it. She exhaled. I'm staying the week. Something in Ethan's chest unwound so completely he was briefly not sure what to do with himself. He nodded. Okay, he said. Is that all you're going to say? What do you want me to say? She considered this. Nothing, she said. Okay is exactly right. That night he made dinner the first time he'd cooked for someone else in a long time. And she sat at the kitchen table and told him about the Chen project in real detail. Not the professional summary version, but the actual version. The 4 years of decisions and compromises and moments of genuine artistic conviction that had gone into it, and he listened the way he listened to things that mattered, which was to say, completely. And somewhere in the middle of her describing the way the east staircase worked, she stopped talking mid-sentence and looked at him. "You're actually interested," she said. It wasn't a question. It had a slightly stunned quality. "Of course I am," he said. "Most people glaze over when I talk about load distribution and Eastern light ratios. Most people aren't carpenters," he said. "I'm interested in how you think about space, how you decide what a room needs. That's the same thing I do, just at a different scale." She stared at him. "Nobody has ever said that to me," she said. "Nobody has ever thought about how your mind works. Nobody in my personal life ever connected what I do to what I am," she said. "They treat it like a job. A successful job, a job to be respected, but a job. Something I go and do and then come back from." She shook her head slightly. "You just said it's the same thing you do. Like we're doing the same thing." "We are," he said. "We're both trying to build spaces that make people feel something they couldn't feel somewhere else." Clara put her fork down. She looked at him across the table for a long moment, and in that moment, Ethan was very aware of the specific nature of what was happening. Not the romantic version, not the movie version, but the real one, which was two people in a kitchen in Montana with the remains of dinner between them, recognizing each other in the specific way that only happens when someone says the thing that is accurate in a way you've never heard before. "Ethan?" she said. "Yeah. I think I might be in trouble," she said. He held her gaze. "Why?" "Because I've been here 36 hours, she said. "And this already feels more like my life than my actual life does." He thought about the right thing to say. He thought about all the careful things he could offer. It takes time. Let's see how the week goes. Don't make decisions based on 36 hours. He said none of them. "I know," he said. "That doesn't scare you." "It scares me," he said. "I'm not 25. I know what it means when something feels real. It means you have to be very careful with it." "And are you going to be careful with it?" He looked at her directly the way he always did with things that mattered. "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly, picked up her fork again, looked at her plate. "Good," she said quietly, "because so am I." They did the dishes together after dinner, which was the kind of ordinary thing that turned out to be surprisingly loaded. She washed, he dried, and she handed things to him, and their hands crossed in the narrow space between them, and neither of them made anything of it. But both of them were aware in the way. You're aware of things. You're being careful of the fact that this was the first ordinary domestic thing they had done together, and it was easy, and it shouldn't have felt like anything, and it felt like everything. He drove her back to Grace's at 9:30. At the door, she turned around the way she had the night before. But tonight, she didn't just look at him. She said, "I want to show you something tomorrow." "What?" "I've been sketching," she said. "On the notepad in Grace's room, since last night. I keep thinking about the garden." "The garden. You turned the beds before winter and left them empty," she said, "on purpose, because you didn't know what I'd want to plant." She paused. "Nobody has ever done that for me before. Left something deliberately empty for me to fill." She met his eyes. "I want to show you what I've been drawing. What I think it could look like if we... She stopped. "I'll show you tomorrow." He stood there in the dark at Grace's front door and felt the exact weight of what she wasn't quite finishing yet. "I'll be here at 9, he said. She nodded, turned toward the door. "Clara," he said. She looked back. "The notepad," he said. "Are you writing or drawing?" A pause. A small smile that she let herself have fully this time. "Both," she said. She went inside. He stood in the cold for a moment after the door closed, not moving, just standing there in the Montana night with the stars overhead and the weight of the last 2 days in his chest, not heavy, not like a burden, but full, the way a house feels full when it finally has people in it. He had been patient for a long time. 11 months of building. 8 weeks of letters before that. Years before that of being a man who kept himself in the background, who showed up for everyone else and asked for very little back, not from martyrdom, but from a genuine belief that what was meant for him would find him if he did his work right. He had believed that. He still believed it. But he hadn't understood until this week that doing your work right meant more than building things. It meant building yourself into someone who could receive what came. He'd spent years preparing the house. He hadn't thought enough about preparing himself. And now she was here, and she was drawing on a notepad in Grace's room, sketching out what the garden could look like, and she'd said, "If we," and hadn't finished the sentence. But she hadn't needed to, because the sentence was already living in the empty garden beds, and the blank sign, and the chair by the window, and every deliberate space he'd left for her to fill. He got in the truck. He drove home with the windows down. He went inside and stood in the kitchen for a long moment in the house he'd built for someone he hadn't known yet, and thought about how strange and true it was that the hardest part hadn't been the building. The hardest part was standing here now in the finished thing, knowing that everything that happened next was entirely up to them, not the house, not the letters, not the months of patience and preparation, them. Two real people with their own histories and habits and fears who had recognized each other across a distance and were now standing for the first time close enough to touch. His phone buzzed. He looked down. Clara. 10:14 p.m. She wrote, "The garden sketch has 14 different things in it. I may have overcommitted. Good night." He stood there and he laughed. Not a small laugh. A real one, the kind that starts in your chest. He wrote back, "I have space for all 14. Good night, Clara." He set the phone down. Outside the house on the Montana hillside, the night was deep and cold and alive with stars, and the garden beds lay dark and ready, and the sign with the carved bird stood at the front path without a name on it waiting. But the waiting had a different quality now. It wasn't the waiting of an empty thing. It was the waiting of a thing about to be filled. She showed him the sketch over coffee the next morning. It wasn't just a garden plan. It was 6 pages torn from Grace's notepad, covered front and back in pencil plants, labeled Rose mapped a trellis system, drawn in careful architectural detail along the south wall. A small herb section near the kitchen door with a note beside it that said, "For cooking, not decoration." And in the corner of the last page, almost like she hadn't meant him to see it, a tiny drawing of the house itself with 2 figures on the porch. Ethan looked at all 6 pages without saying anything, took his time with each one. Clara sat across from him with both hands around her coffee cup, watching him with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. "You said 14 things," he said finally. "I know. I count 19. I got on a roll." He looked up at her. She was bracing slightly the way people do when they've shown someone something real and are waiting to find out if it was a mistake. "Clara," he said, "if it's too much." "It's perfect," he said. She exhaled. The bracing let go all at once visibly, like something physical had released in her shoulders. "I got carried away," she said. "I told you last night I had room for all 14, he said. "I have room for 19. I have room for however many things you want to put in that garden." She looked at him steadily. "You know we're not just talking about the garden." "I know," he said. She picked up her coffee, drank, set it down. "I keep doing that," she said. "Talking about the garden and meaning something else." "I keep understanding what you mean," he said. "That's either very good or very alarming," she said. "Probably both," he said. She smiled. He smiled. And for a moment the kitchen was just the kitchen, and they were just 2 people having coffee in the morning, and it was ordinary in a way that felt to both of them completely extraordinary. Then the week began in earnest, and the week was not a montage. It was not a series of romantic moments strung together with good lighting and no friction. It was real, which meant it had texture and difficulty, and moments that were funny, and moments that were hard, and moments where both of them had to decide actively and consciously to keep going. The first real friction came on day 3. Clara had been using the corner bedroom as a workspace. Sitting at the desk, Ethan had built her laptop open, working on the logistics of Monday's remote presentation, while also he suspected drafting something else entirely in a second document she minimized whenever he came to the door. He didn't ask about the second document. He figured she'd show him when she was ready. What he didn't expect was to walk past the bedroom at noon and hear her on the phone, voice-tight talking to someone who wasn't Martin. He heard enough to understand before he moved away from the door. She was talking to a realtor in Seattle. About her apartment. Not about selling it. About renewing the lease. He went outside, stood in the cold for a while, worked on the section of back fence he'd been meaning to repair for weeks. Let his hands do something concrete while his mind did its slower work. She found him there an hour later. She came and stood beside the fence and didn't say anything for a moment. He could feel her working up to it. "I heard," he said. "Saved her the build-up." A pause. "How much?" "Enough." She put her hands in her jacket pockets. "My lease is up in 6 weeks," she said. "I told the realtor I'd let her know by end of week." "Okay," he said. "I'm not Ethan. I'm not deciding against this. I want you to know that." "I know," he said. He kept working on the fence, straightening a post that had leaned through the winter. "But I can't make a decision about where I live based on 5 days," she said. "I have a life in Seattle. I have a career and clients and a storage unit full of things I actually like. I can't just—" "I know," he said again. "Stop saying I know." He stopped working, turned to look at her. "What do you want me to say?" he said. "I want you to say what you're actually thinking," she said, "because you're being very calm and very reasonable, and I've been around you for 4 days, and I know that's not always the same thing as being okay." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "You want to know what I'm actually thinking?" "Yes. I'm thinking that I knew this wasn't going to be simple," he said. "I knew it when I built the house. I knew it when I wrote the letter. I knew it when I planted the tulips in the mud in March. I'm not an idiot, Clara. I didn't build all of this because I thought love was going to show up clean and uncomplicated." He set down the tool in his hand. "I'm thinking that 6 weeks isn't very long and that a lot can change in 6 weeks. I'm thinking that you are a person who has spent her whole life making the safe decision and that I'm not going to be the thing that pressures you into a decision before you're ready." He paused. "And I'm thinking that the gap between what I want and what I'm going to ask for right now is something I'm going to have to sit with." She was very still. "What do you want?" she said quietly. He looked right at her. "You know what I want," he said. A beat of silence. The wind, the sound of the fence post settling. "Yes," she said. "I do." "Then you also know I'm not going to ask for it before you're ready to give it," he said. "That's not how I build things." She looked at him for another long moment. Something was moving through her expression that was complicated gratitude and guilt, and something deeper, something that looked almost like grief, the particular grief of someone who is getting something they needed, and realizing too late how long they've been without it. "I'm going to figure it out," she said. "I need you to trust me to figure it out." "I trust you," he said. Without hesitation, she blinked. We've known each other in person for 4 days." "I've known you for 8 months," he said. 4 days in person, 8 months in letters. I know how you think. I know what you do when you're afraid. I know you're going to choose right when you have enough room to choose." He picked up the tool again. "Give yourself the room." She stood there for another moment. Then she walked over and put her hand on his arm briefly, a light pressure there, and gone the kind of touch that says something that isn't words yet. Then she went back inside. He turned back to the fence and worked until his hands stopped feeling tight. That evening, something shifted again. Daniel came for dinner. Ethan had mentioned it the night before, and Daniel had characteristically taken this as a firm invitation, rather than a casual heads-up, and arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine and the particular energy of a man determined to be very normal about everything. He was, to his credit, mostly normal. He and Clara talked for 2 hours about architecture, about how spaces affect behavior, about the research coming out of environmental psychology that was changing how hospitals and schools thought about design. Clara was sharper in this conversation than Ethan had seen her in anything work-adjacent. Not the professional version, but genuinely engaged. Debating, pushing back on Daniel's points, and Daniel, who was a structural engineer, and had opinions pushed back on hers. And it was the first time Ethan had seen her be fully herself in an intellectual argument, without managing it, without being careful about being likable. She was not particularly careful about being likable when she was convinced she was right. Ethan found this deeply attractive and didn't say so. At one point, Daniel said in the middle of a point about cantilever design, "Wait, Clara? Have you seen what Ethan did with the load distribution on the east wall of this house? Because that's exactly what you're talking about." Clara turned to look at Ethan. "Show me." So Ethan showed her, walked her through the structural decisions he'd made, the way he'd solved the problem of the large east-facing windows without compromising the wall's integrity, using a solution he'd worked out over 2 weeks with a lot of failed paper models. Clara listened and then started asking questions that were better than the questions most engineers asked him. And at some point, Daniel had faded to the background entirely, and it was just the two of them standing in the half-lit hallway, talking about load distribution, with an intensity that had very little to do with load distribution. Daniel left at 9 with the expression of a man who had witnessed something he was going to need to process. At the door, he caught Ethan's eye and gave him a look that communicated without a single word. Approximately, "I take back everything I ever said that wasn't completely supportive of this." Ethan nodded once. Daniel left. The 4th day was the Monday presentation. Clara was up at 5:30. Ethan knew because he heard her moving in the kitchen. She'd stayed at the house the night before for the first time in the corner bedroom with the morning light and the chair by the window, because the logistics of the presentation made it practical, and they were both adult enough to be practical, and he lay in his room and listened to her make coffee and thought about how strange and right it was to hear someone else in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning. He got up at 6. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop and 3 pages of printed notes, and the particular focus expression he'd come to recognize on her, the one where she was completely elsewhere in her mind, running through something complex and demanding. He made eggs, put a plate beside her without interrupting. She ate without looking up. Then 10 minutes later she blinked, looked at the empty plate, looked at him. "You fed me," she said. "You were working," he said. "I didn't even notice." "I know." She looked at him with that open expression again, the one she kept not quite managing to guard. "Nobody has ever just fed me without making it a thing," she said. "It's eggs," he said. "Ethan." Clara. "Stop being casually extraordinary," she said. "It's very destabilizing." He sat down across from her. "How are you feeling about the presentation?" She looked at her notes. "Good. Ready. Nervous about Martin being in the room in Seattle while I'm presenting from here. He's going to find a way to make it complicated." "How?" "He'll ask a question mid-presentation that requires a visual I don't have queued up," she said. "He does it in person, too. He thinks it tests whether you really know the material or whether you're just performing the material." "Do you know the material?" She looked at him flatly. "I have spent 4 years on this project." "Then you'll be fine." "I know," she said. Then quieter. "I know. I want it to go well. Not for Martin, for Marcus. He's a good client. He deserves a good presentation." "Then give him one," Ethan said. She squared her notes, squared her shoulders, looked at her laptop screen. Then she looked at Ethan one more time. "Thank you for the eggs," she said. "Any time," he said. She went into the corner bedroom and closed the door, and for the next 2 hours, Ethan worked outside close enough to be there if she needed anything far enough to give her the silence the room was built for. At 9:15 the door opened. He was on the porch. He turned around. Her face told him everything before she said a word. He cried, she said. Marcus Chen cried at a presentation. She stood in the doorway, looking slightly stunned. He said it was exactly what he'd hoped for, and more than he'd expected. And then he cried. Ethan looked at her. Of course he did, he said. You can't say of course he did. You told me what you put into that project, he said. Of course, he cried. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. Martin is going to be impossible about this because now he's going to take credit for the crying. Let him, Ethan said. Easy for you to say. Clara. Marcus Chen cried at your presentation. That's the thing. That's what you built toward. Let Martin have whatever narrative he needs. She stood there in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked across the porch and sat down in the second chair, the one that had been empty since Ethan put it there, the one Roy had noticed, and Daniel had noticed, and that Ethan himself had looked at 100 times in the past year, and sat in it like it had always been hers. He looked at her sitting in that chair. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything about the chair. They didn't need to. What do we do now? She said. What do you want to do? She looked out over the property. The garden beds dark and ready. The apple trees at the back. The ridge line in the distance with the 3 mountain ranges on the other side. I want to plant something, she said. So they planted. It was too early in the season for most of what she'd drawn on the notepad, but there were cold-tolerant things, kale spinach, the early lettuces, the herbs closest to the house. She'd ordered seeds online during her first night at Grace's, which she told him now with a slight expression that was somewhere between sheepish and unashamed, and they'd arrived that morning. They worked side by side in the garden beds for 3 hours, and this was where the real learning happened. Not the dramatic moments, the ordinary ones. She had opinions about row spacing that conflicted with his. She was wrong about the row spacing. She also didn't respond well to being told she was wrong initially. Not aggressively, she didn't get angry, didn't shut down. But there was a stiffening, a pulling in a very brief moment where she started to smooth it over instead of engaging with it. He caught it. You're doing the thing, he said. She looked up. What thing? The thing where you decide not to push back because it's easier to just agree and move past it. A pause. I wasn't going to. Clara. She sat back on her heels, looked at him, then looked at the row spacing. Your spacing is too tight for what the kale needs, she said. It'll crowd out before it matures. I've been growing kale in this soil for 8 years, he said. And I've been studying plant behavior in compressed growing conditions for a landscape project I worked on for 2 years, she said. So we both have information. He looked at the row, looked at her. How much spacing do you want? He said. 4 more inches. He moved his marker 4 inches. Thank you, she said. If the kale dies, I'm not saying I told you so, he said. If the kale dies, you don't have to, she said. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and both of them were aware in exactly the same moment that this was the first real disagreement they'd had, and they had moved through it in approximately 90 seconds without either of them backing down or blowing it up. Huh, she said. Yeah, he said. That was easy, she said. Most things are easier than we think they're going to be, he said. And some things are harder. The trick is knowing which is which before you find out. She went back to planting. So did he. 3 rows later, she said, What's harder than you thought it was going to be? He thought about it seriously the way she'd learned to expect him to. Watching you get ready to leave, he said. Every evening when I drive you back to Grace's. Or when you close the laptop and go quiet because you're thinking about Seattle. That part is harder than I built myself up for. Her hands slowed in the soil. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be sorry, he said. I asked you to be honest. That's honest. What's easier? She said. He didn't hesitate. You, he said. You're easier than I thought, which sounds like a strange thing to say. But I spent a lot of time building towards someone, and I was afraid the real person would be harder to know than the person in the letters. You're not. You're exactly as real as I hoped. She was very still for a moment. I'm not easy, she said quietly. I want you to know that. I'm complicated, and I overwork, and I have trust issues that are going to come up at inconvenient times, and I'm bad at asking for help, and I've been told by more than one person that I'm difficult to love." "Who told you that?" he said. "An ex," she said. 3 years ago. We were together for 2 years, and when we ended, he said I was difficult to love because I was always somewhere else in my head." Ethan looked at her steadily. "He wasn't wrong that you're somewhere else in your head sometimes," he said. "You are. But that's not difficult to love. That's just how you're built. And the person who loves you learns to recognize when you're present and when you're working through something, and they don't take it personally, and they make eggs." He paused. The person who called that difficult wasn't paying the right kind of attention. Clara had stopped pretending to plant. She was looking at him with the most unguarded expression he'd seen, yet not the cracked open look from the first day, not the careful brightness she deployed in harder moments. Just her. Stripped of everything except the thing she was feeling right now. "I called the realtor back this morning," she said. His hands stilled. "Before the presentation," she said. "I told her I wasn't renewing the lease." The garden was very quiet. "Clara, I'm not moving to Montana tomorrow," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I have 6 weeks to figure out logistics, and I have a career that I need to reshape, not abandon, and I don't know exactly how this looks yet." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were doing the filling up thing again, and this time she let it happen. "But I'm not renewing the lease on an apartment that feels like a waiting room. I'm not doing that." Ethan set down what he was holding. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had flown to Montana on faith, who had shown him 6 pages of garden sketches on the second morning, who had pushed back on the row spacing and cried in the empty bedroom and made him laugh over eggs, and called her boss and held her ground, and sat in the second chair on the porch like it had always been hers. "You don't have to have it figured out," he said. "I know. I built this place to be added to," he said. "Remember I told you that. Not finished. Started right." She smiled through the wet eyes. It was a real smile, the kind that used her whole face. "You compared me to a building again," she said. "I did," he said. "I genuinely cannot stop doing that." She laughed. The kind of laugh that comes after you've been close to crying, brighter than usual, a little relieved. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, he agreed. "I'm going to need help with the logistics." "I know people," he said. "You know Roy and Daniel." "Roy knows everyone in this county, and Daniel is an engineer," he said. "Between the 3 of us, we can figure out how to move one person from Seattle to Montana." She shook her head, slightly smiling. "You make it sound simple." "The moving part is simple," he said. "The rest is just one thing at a time." "One row at a time," she said, looking at the garden. "Exactly." She picked up the trowel, went back to work. He went back to work. The sun moved. The garden took shape. The rows of small things, the kale, with its 4 extra inches of breathing room, the herbs in their section near the kitchen door, began to look like what they were going to be. That evening, the last evening of her planned week, Clara did not go back to Grace's. Not because anything dramatic happened. Not because they had a conversation that settled things. She just didn't go. At 8 o'clock, she was in the armchair with the book she'd been reading since the first day, and at 9 o'clock, Ethan made tea, and at 10 o'clock, she was still there, and neither of them said anything about it, and at some point she put the book down and looked at the fire and said, "I don't want to go back tonight." "Then don't," he said. She looked at him. This isn't," she started. "I know what it is," he said. "You want to stay in the house. That's what it is." She settled back in the chair. "That's what it is," she agreed. He went and got a blanket from the hall closet, a good one heavy wool, something his mother had made years ago that he'd kept because he could never bring himself not to, and put it on the arm of her chair without making a production of it. She pulled it over herself, picked up the book. He sat in the other chair and read his own book, and the fire worked through the night, and the house did what it had been built to do. It held them. At 11:30, Clara said without looking up from her page, Ethan. Yeah. I'm going to need a bookshelf in the corner bedroom. He turned a page. I know. I have a lot of books. I built the shelves deep, he said. 2 rows. She looked up at him then. You planned for that, she said. I planned for a person who reads 5 books at once, he said. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment with the firelight on her face. I'm going to write something, she said. While I'm here, I've been thinking about it since the first night. An essay about what it means to design spaces for other people for 10 years and then walk into a space that was designed for you. She paused. I want to write about this house, about what it feels like from the inside. Ethan was quiet. You should write it, he said. In the corner bedroom. That's what the desk is for, he said. She nodded slowly, looked back at her book, then looked at him one more time. Thank you for building me somewhere to write it, she said. He looked at the fire. Thank you for having something to write, he said. She went back to her book. He went back to his. The fire burned. The house was warm. Somewhere outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did, cold and clear and enormous. But inside the walls, Ethan had built in the light of the fire, and the 2 chairs finally occupied, and the book on the shelf that Clara had been reading since the first afternoon. There was something that had no clean name in the language he usually used for things. Not happiness exactly, though it was that. Not relief, though it was that too. It was closer to what he felt when a long and complicated build finally came together, when all the decisions that had seemed uncertain, all the joints and angles and load-bearing choices resolved into something that stood solid and true, and would stand long after he was done with it. It was the feeling of a thing built right, the feeling that he had come to trust over 36 years of building things, that when you put the right intention and the right patience and the right honesty into something, it held. It held. Clara turned a page. He turned a page. Outside, the stars were out in full over the Montana hillside, and the garden had the first small things in it, now just started. Not yet what they would be, and the sign at the front path still had no name on it. But that too would come in time, when the right moment arrived, the way things came when you didn't force them. One thing at a time, one row at a time. That was how you built a life. Not all at once, just started right. 6 weeks later, a moving truck came up the gravel road. It was a Tuesday morning, overcast, the kind of day that couldn't decide between winter and spring, and had settled on something uncomfortable in between. Ethan heard it before he saw it, the low grinding effort of a large vehicle negotiating a road that was not designed for large vehicles, and he came out of the workshop and stood in the yard and watched it come around the bend. He had offered to help her pack. She had said no. She had said that packing was something she needed to do alone, that there was a process of sorting through a life that required solitude in a way she couldn't fully explain, and he had understood that, and respected it, and spent the 6 weeks doing what he always did when he was waiting on something important. He worked. He built her bookshelf. Not the one already in the corner bedroom, that one was built in floor to ceiling, deep enough for 2 rows. This was a freestanding one for the living room, because Clara had mentioned in one of the daily calls that had replaced the letters over the past 6 weeks that she had boxes of art books too large for standard shelves, and nowhere she'd ever been able to keep them properly. He built it from old-growth Douglas fir, a piece he'd been saving for 3 years, waiting for the right project, and it was the best piece of furniture he had ever made in his life. He knew it while he was making it. His hands knew it. Some things you build to spec, and some things you build beyond spec, because the reason for them lifts you past what you thought you were capable of, and this was one of those. He did not tell Clara about it. He wanted her to see it when she arrived. Now the truck was here, and 2 movers were climbing out of the cab, and a white rental car was pulling up behind it, and the door opened, and Clara stepped out, and looked at the house, and then looked at him. And her face did something complicated that resolved after a second into the particular expression he had come to know as her version of relief. The one where she was fighting the impulse to immediately start managing the logistics and was choosing instead to just feel the moment she was standing in. "Hi?" she said. "Hi," he said. They looked at each other across the yard for a moment, with the movers standing awkwardly beside the truck. "You going to hug me or just stand there?" she said. He crossed the yard and hugged her. She hugged back hard, the way you hug someone after 6 weeks of phone calls, both hands gripping the back of his jacket, her face against his shoulder for 1 full second before she pulled back, and was Clara again, present functional, already scanning the logistics. "The truck is bigger than I thought it would be," she said. "I thought I'd pared down more." "How much did you actually get rid of?" he said. A pause. "The furniture. Most of the furniture. How many boxes?" She looked at the truck. 43. He nodded. "I know," she said. "I know that's a lot." "I built more shelves," he said. She turned to look at him. "You built more shelves." "Come see the living room when the movers are unloading," he said. "But yes." She stared at him for a moment, with the expression she got when he did something she didn't expect, which was an expression that started at disbelief and moved fairly quickly towards something much warmer. "You built them before I got here," she said. Not a question. "I knew you were coming," he said. She pressed her lips together, looked at the house, looked back at him. "Okay," she said. "I'm not going to cry in front of the movers." "Very professional," he said. "Shut up," she said. But she was smiling, and she turned to direct the movers, and Ethan went to help carry things, and the day began in earnest. The unpacking took 2 full days. Roy showed up on the first day, of course he did with Daniel in tow, and the 4 of them moved boxes and argued mildly about where things should go, and found a rhythm that was against all odds, not chaotic. Roy carried the heaviest things without being asked. Daniel provided structural opinions about the bookshelves that nobody had requested, but that were occasionally useful. Clara directed all of it with the precise spatial intelligence of a person who had spent a decade understanding exactly how objects related to each other in rooms, which meant she knew within seconds of a box entering a space where it needed to go, and the men learned quickly to just ask her and do what she said. At one point, Roy said, struggling with a box of art books, "These are extremely heavy for something that's just pictures." "They're not just pictures," Clara said without looking up. "They're the reason I do what I do." Roy set the box down exactly where she'd indicated. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Daniel caught Ethan's eye across the room and mouthed something that looked like "she fits." Ethan looked away before he responded to that, because he would not have been able to keep his face neutral. On the second afternoon after the movers had gone, and Roy and Daniel had been fed and sent home, Clara and Ethan stood in the living room, surrounded by the last of the unpacked boxes, and Clara saw the bookshelf properly for the first time. She had noticed it that morning, had registered. It had said, "Wait, that's new," while simultaneously directing a mover, but she hadn't had the space to actually look at it until now. She looked at it now. She walked to it slowly, ran her hand along the top shelf the same way she'd run her hand along the walls the first time she walked into the house checking, feeling the quality of it. She crouched down and looked at the joinery at the bottom corners, stood up and stepped back. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. This is the most beautiful piece of furniture I have ever seen in person." He was quiet. "I'm not being kind," she said. "I'm being accurate. I have been in houses with furniture that costs more than your truck. This is better. How did you this wood?" "I was saving it," he said, "for the right thing." She turned to look at him. "How long?" 3 years, he said. Her expression did something slow and complex, the way her expressions did when something landed deep instead of just on the surface. "You saved a piece of wood for 3 years, she said, "and used it for my bookshelf." "I didn't know it was for your bookshelf when I saved it," he said. "I just knew it was for something that mattered." She looked at the shelf, looked at him. "I need to start putting books on it immediately," she said, "or I'm going to say something embarrassingly sincere." "Go ahead," he said. She looked at him sharply. Say something embarrassingly sincere. If you want to, he said. A beat. I love you, she said. The living room was very still. She looked slightly startled by herself, the way people look when the true thing comes out before the managed version. Her chin came up slightly, the unconscious gesture he'd learned meant she was holding her ground with something. I wasn't planning to say that today, she said. I know, he said. But it's true, so I'm not taking it back. I'm not asking you to, he said. He crossed the room, stopped in front of her, looked at her directly the way he always did with things that mattered. Not dramatic, not performing the moment, just fully present in it. I love you too, he said. I have for a while. I didn't want to say it before you were here because I didn't want it to feel like pressure. It wouldn't have felt like pressure, she said. I know that now, he said. I didn't know it then. She looked at him for a moment. We wasted some time, she said. We took the time we needed, he said. That's a nicer way to say the same thing. I know, he said. She laughed, the real laugh, the one that used her whole face, and he put his arms around her and she let him, and they stood in the living room with the magnificent bookshelf and the 43 boxes and the entire accumulated material of Clara Whitmore's Seattle life waiting to be unpacked, and for a moment, neither of them needed to say or do anything else. The moment held. Then Clara said, muffled slightly by his jacket, I need to tell you something. Okay. She pulled back just enough to look at him. Her expression was serious now, but not frightened. Decided. I quit, she said. Martin, the firm. I handed in my notice 3 weeks ago. I didn't tell you because I wanted to be sure I wasn't doing it for the wrong reasons. Ethan went very still. Clara, let me finish, she said. I've been thinking about this since before I came to Montana the first time. The Marcus Chen project, when he cried in that presentation, the first thing I felt wasn't professional pride. It was grief. Because I realized I had spent 4 years doing something that mattered to me, and I'd spent most of it feeling like a contractor instead of a designer. Martin owns the relationship with every client I've ever had. I can't do my best work inside that structure anymore. She held his gaze. I'm going to build my own practice. Smaller, less prestigious probably for a while, remote capable. And I want to do something I've never done. I want to design spaces for real people, not trophy homes, spaces that actually change how people live. Ethan looked at her. How long have you been planning this? He said. Since the second day I was here, she said. When you told me you ask people what they need, not what they want. I thought that's what I'm supposed to be doing. That's what I was trained to do, and I stopped. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? He said. She blinked. What? To make this work, he said. What do you need from me? She stared at him. You're not going to tell me it's risky. It is risky, he said. I'm not going to tell you something you already know. What do you need? She looked at him for a long moment, with the expression that meant she was recalibrating something. The expression she got when he didn't respond the way the men in her professional life had trained her to expect. I need a proper workspace, she said finally. The corner bedroom is right for writing, but I need room for plans and models. A bigger desk. Northern light if possible. I can build that, he said. I know you can, she said. That's why I'm asking. Where? She turned and looked at the wall of the living room, the one with the window that faced north. There, she said. If we move the bar, done, he said. She looked at him. I haven't finished the sentence. You were going to say move the reading chairs to the east wall and take out the side table, he said. I've thought about it. I think it works better anyway. She stared at him. How did you know that? She said. Because I know how you think about rooms, he said. And I know where you put yourself when you're working. You always face north when you're really concentrating. You did it at Grace's. You did it in the kitchen when you were prepping the presentation. She opened her mouth, closed it. Stop noticing things about me, she said. It's very disorienting. No, he said. She shook her head slowly, something warm moving through her expression. Okay, she said. Okay. I'm going to start unpacking books, and you're going to figure out the north wall, and we're going to make this work. We are, he said. She turned to the boxes. Then she stopped. Ethan. Yeah. I'm scared, she said. I want you to know that. I quit a job I've had for 10 years. I moved to a state I've visited once. I'm starting a business with no clients and no local reputation, and the only person I know within 100 miles is you and Roy and Daniel. You also know Grace, he said. Grace makes excellent coffee and has strong opinions about hydrangeas, Clara said. She's wonderful. She's not a professional network. No, he said. But she knows everyone in this county, and Roy knows everyone, and Daniel works with contractors across 3 states. He paused. You're not starting from zero. You're starting from here. That's different. She looked at him. You really believe that, she said. It wasn't skepticism. It was something closer to wonder, the expression of someone who has spent so long surrounded by conditional support that unconditional support feels like a foreign language they're only now beginning to understand. I built a house for you before I knew you, he said. Yes, I believe it. She turned back to the boxes. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. They unpacked until midnight. The months that followed were not a fairy tale, and neither of them would have wanted one. They were 2 adults who had spent their whole lives being competent and self-sufficient, and who were now learning with varying degrees of grace how to be those things together instead of separately. Clara launched her practice in the fall. She called it Whitmore Studio, which Ethan thought was exactly right, clean hers, no hedging. Her first client was a family in Billings who had found her through an article she'd written, the essay she'd started in the corner bedroom, about designing spaces for people who had never had a space designed for them. The article had gone somewhere unexpected online, had been shared in communities Ethan didn't know existed, had landed in the inboxes of people who read it and felt, in Clara's words about the house, that she had somehow written the thing they felt but hadn't known how to say. The Billings family wanted her to redesign their home to accommodate a daughter with cerebral palsy who was moving back in after years in a care facility. It was the smallest project Clara had taken on in a decade. It was the first project in a decade that made her feel like herself. She told Ethan about it over dinner, 3 weeks in going through the design decisions, the way she had that first evening. Specific, alive, not performing enthusiasm, but actually in it. And he listened and asked questions, and she talked until 10 o'clock, and then stopped abruptly and said, I'm doing it again. You should have stopped me. Why would I stop you? He said. Because I've been talking for 2 hours. I know, he said. I was there. You were interested for 2 hours. I'm always interested, he said, in how you think. I told you that a long time ago. She looked at him across the dinner table. I keep waiting, she said, for the part where you stop meaning what you say. He looked back at her. Keep waiting, he said. You'll be waiting a long time. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. They sat like that for a moment. Roy asked me today, she said, if we were going to get married. Ethan was quiet for a beat. What did you say? I said that was between me and you, and he should mind his own business. Good answer. He said he planted 6 tulips and felt entitled to some information. He's never going to let that go, Ethan said. No, Clara said. She was smiling. He's not. A pause. What would you have said if he'd asked you instead of me? Ethan looked at her hand on his, looked up at her face. I would have said the same thing, he said, that it's between us. And between us, she said. He didn't answer right away. That was his way, not hesitation, not avoidance, but the real consideration that she had come to trust as the thing that meant his answer was going to be true. I know what I want, he said. Tell me, she said. I want to put a name on that sign at the front path, he said. I've wanted to since the day you walked in. I left it blank because it wasn't my name to put there. But I know what I want it to say. She was very still. What do you want it to say? She said. He looked at her, Directly. The way he always looked at things that mattered. "Caldwell," he said. "Both of us." The kitchen was completely quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Her hand was still on his. Her eyes were doing the thing, the filling up thing, and this time she didn't blink it back, just let it happen quietly. "Is that a proposal?" she said. Her voice was steady. "It's what I want," he said. "What do you want?" She looked down at their hands, looked back up. "I want to put my name on that sign," she said. "I want that very much." "That's a yes," he said. "That's a yes," she said. He nodded once, slow, the way he acknowledged things that were permanent. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They looked at each other. "That was not a romantic proposal," she said. "No," he agreed. "There was no ring." "I'll make you something," he said. "If you want a ring, or I won't. You can choose." She thought about it. "Make me something," she said. "Not a ring. Something you made." "What do you want?" She looked at the Douglas fir bookshelf across the room, the one he'd built from the piece of wood he'd been saving for 3 years. She looked back at him. "Surprise me," she said. 2 months later, he put a name on the sign. He did it on a morning in January, early before Clara was up. She was in the corner bedroom. He could see the lamp on through the window, already at the desk. He took the chisel he used for fine work, and he stood at the front path in the cold, and he carved the letters slowly, the way he did everything that mattered, with full attention, without rushing getting it right. Caldwell, 7 letters, clean and deep in the wood. He stepped back and looked at it. Then he went inside and made coffee, and waited. He heard her before he saw her, the particular sound of her moving through the house in the morning, the specific rhythm of it that he had learned, the way you learn the sounds of a place you belong to. She came into the kitchen, saw the coffee, poured herself a cup, looked at him. "You're up early," she said. "Had something to do," he said. She looked at him over her cup, the look that meant she was reading him, which she had gotten very good at. "What did you do?" she said. "Go look at the sign," he said. She set down her cup, went to the window, looked out at the front path. He watched her see it. She was still for a long moment. Her hand came up and pressed flat against the glass, the same gesture she'd made the first day she walked into the house, checking if it was real. Then she turned around. Her face was completely open. No performance, no management, no professional composure. Just Clara, 32 years old, standing in her kitchen in Montana in January in the early morning, with coffee going cold on the counter, and her name carved into the wood outside. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. She crossed the kitchen and he stood up, and she put her arms around him and held on, and he held back, and the house was warm and quiet around them, with the lamp on in the corner bedroom, and the coffee steaming on the counter, and the Douglas fir bookshelf full of her books along the north wall, and the garden outside under its January frost waiting for spring. Eventually she said against his shoulder, "The kale made it." "I know," he said. "You were right about the soil. You were right about the spacing," he said. She pulled back and looked at him, a small smile at the corner of her mouth, the one she didn't try to control anymore. "We were both right," she said. "That's going to happen sometimes," he said. "And sometimes one of us is going to be wrong." "Yes," he said. "And we're going to handle it in 90 seconds like reasonable adults," she said. "That's the plan," he said. "I like the plan," she said. She picked up her coffee, went back to the window and looked at the sign one more time. At her name, their name carved clean and permanent in the wood. "I need to call Roy," she said. "Why?" "Because he planted 6 tulips and he deserves to know." Ethan almost smiled. "He's going to be impossible about it." "Absolutely insufferable," she agreed. "Do you have his number?" "You have his number." "I know," she said. "I just wanted to hear you say it." She picked up her phone, then set it back down, turned to look at him one more time. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you for building this before I knew I needed it," she said. "Thank you for the morning light in the bedroom, and the deep shelves and the second chair, and the empty garden, and the sign with no name on it." She paused. "Thank you for knowing what I needed before I did." He looked at her steadily. "Thank you for getting on the plane," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her face that was the full accumulation of everything: the letters, the first afternoon, the phone call with Martin, the row, spacing argument, the moving truck, the bookshelf, the name on the sign, all of it distilled into a single expression that had no name in any language, but that both of them understood completely. "I wasn't going to," she said. "You know that." "I know," he said. "I almost didn't." "But you did," he said. "But I did," she said. She picked up her phone. Called Roy. He answered on the second ring, and before she could say a word he said, "You put a name on the sign, didn't you?" And Clara laughed so hard she had to sit down. Outside the window, the sign stood at the front path in the January cold. 7 letters carved deep and clean. 2 people's future written in the wood. The garden waited under the frost. 14 things, 19 actually ready to come back. The house stood on the Montana hillside, the same way it had stood since April of last year, solid and sure built, right, built to be added to. In the corner bedroom, the lamp was on, and the chair was by the window, and the desk had the marks on it that a desk accumulates when someone is doing real work. The marks of a person who has finally found the place where the words come. In the living room, the bookshelf held everything she had carried with her from the life she'd outgrown, held it properly at the right depth with room for more. And in the kitchen, 2 people stood with their coffee in the January morning, in a house that had never been about the house, in a life that neither of them had managed to build alone. Some things you cannot build by yourself. Some things require you to leave the space and trust that the right person will come and fill it. Ethan Caldwell had known that on a dark morning 11 months before, Clara arrived standing on empty ground in the cold, knowing without logic or proof that the thing he was about to build was not for him alone. He had been right, not because fate handed it to him, not because love arrived clean and easy and without cost, but because he had built something true, and she had been brave enough to walk into it, and they had both been stubborn enough to stay. That was the whole of it. That was all it ever was, and all it needed to be. The house stood on the hillside, the name was on the sign, and the second chair on the porch was never empty again.